December 3, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and Technical Sergeant James Holloway watched through frosted barracks windows as the newly arrived Japanese prisoners of war stepped off the transport trucks, their thin cotton uniforms offering no protection against the brutal Midwestern winter. What happened over the next 6 months would shatter every assumption these men held about their enemy, not through violence or intimidation, but through something far more unexpected: food. The laughter that echoed from Processing Building 7 that first evening would haunt Holloway for years, not because it was cruel, but because of how quickly it would transform into stunned silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The men shuffling through the intake procedures that December evening represented the last remnants of Japan's once mighty military machine. They had been captured in the final weeks of the Pacific War, pulled from caves in Okinawa, from bunkers in the Philippines, from isolated garrisons that had fought on even after the Emperor's surrender broadcast. Sergeant Holloway had processed over 2,000 prisoners since his assignment to Camp McCoy in April 1945, but this group was different. These were Imperial Japanese Army veterans, men who had survived years of brutal combat, men who still carried themselves with rigid military bearing despite their defeat. Holloway had grown up on a farm in rural Nebraska, the son of immigrants who had fled the Dust Bowl hoping for better fortune further north. He understood hunger in ways most Americans never would. His family had survived on potatoes and cabbage for entire winters, had stretched single chickens into week-long meals, had learned to make flour last twice as long by cutting it with ground acorns. When he enlisted in 1942 at age 19, the Army had seemed like a guarantee of regular meals as much as a patriotic duty. Now at 23, he found himself responsible for feeding the very men he had been trained to kill. The processing hall was overheated, the coal furnaces working overtime against the Wisconsin cold. The prisoners stood in lines, their faces carefully neutral as American medical personnel examined them, as clerks recorded their names and ranks, as supply sergeants issued them winter clothing that seemed impossibly thick compared to what they had worn. Holloway noticed how their eyes tracked everything, cataloging details, maintaining the vigilance that had kept them alive through years of war. They were not broken men, they were soldiers who had lost, and there was a difference. Captain Robert Chen, the camp's liaison officer, had warned Holloway about what to expect. Chen was Chinese-American, spoke fluent Japanese, and had spent the previous year interrogating prisoners across the Pacific theater. He understood the Japanese military mind better than almost anyone in the American command structure. They've been told for years that Americans are soft, decadent, that we lack the spiritual strength to endure hardship. Chen had explained during the briefing, food is going to be a flashpoint. They're going to see our rations as proof of weakness, of excess. Be prepared for contempt. The first meal service came at 1800 hours. The prisoners were marched to Mess Hall 3, a cavernous wooden structure that could seat 400 men at long tables. Holloway supervised as his mess crew brought out the evening's menu, standard Army fare that seemed unremarkable to American sensibilities, but represented abundance beyond comprehension to men who had been starving. Meatloaf with brown gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread with butter, apple pie, coffee with real sugar and condensed milk. The laughter started almost immediately. It began with a young lieutenant named Takeshi Yamamoto, formerly of the 32nd Army, who had been pulled from a cave system in southern Okinawa, where he and 60 men had held out for 3 weeks after the island's official surrender. Yamamoto looked at the loaded tray handed to him by a cheerful mess sergeant and began to laugh, a sound that started as a chuckle but built into something approaching hysteria. Within seconds, other prisoners joined in, the sound rippling through the mess hall like a wave. Holloway didn't need Chen's translation to understand the mockery in that laughter. These men were looking at American military rations and seeing confirmation of everything their propaganda had told them. The portions were obscene by Japanese standards. The waste implicit in offering such variety to common soldiers seemed to prove American decadence. The fact that this food was being served to prisoners, to defeated enemies, made it even more absurd in their eyes. Sergeant Kenji Matsuda, who had served as a supply officer in the Philippine campaign, stood up and addressed his fellow prisoners in rapid Japanese. Chen translated quietly for Holloway. He's saying this explains why Japan lost. He says no nation that feeds its soldiers like this can possibly have the discipline to fight properly. He's saying Americans are so soft they need to be bribed with luxury food just to get them to fight. He's saying this is embarrassing, that they should refuse to eat it out of pride. But hunger trumped pride. The men ate, though many made a show of disdain, picking at their food with exaggerated disgust, commenting loudly to their neighbors about the poor quality, the strange flavors, the obvious inferiority of American cooking. Holloway watched Yamamoto take 3 helpings of meatloaf while complaining about how tasteless it was. He saw Matsuda return to the serving line twice for more bread while lecturing others about American wastefulness. The cognitive dissonance was painful to observe. What the prisoners didn't understand, what they couldn't have known, was that the food they were mocking represented the absolute bottom tier of American military rations. This was standard garrison fare, the most basic cost-effective menu the Army could provide while still meeting minimum nutritional standards. It was the food that American soldiers complained about constantly, that generated endless griping and creative profanity, that prompted thousands of care packages from home filled with anything that might make mess hall food more palatable. Holloway had eaten this exact meal at least 200 times since his enlistment. He found it boring, occasionally nauseating in its sameness, and dreamed constantly of his mother's pot roast or the fried chicken they used to have on Sundays. Every American soldier in the camp felt the same way. The food was adequate, filling, nutritionally complete, and mind-numbingly dull. It was fuel, not cuisine. The idea that anyone would consider it luxurious seemed absurd. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself. Every meal became an opportunity for the prisoners to express their contempt for American softness. They laughed at pancakes with maple syrup at breakfast. They mocked the portions of scrambled eggs served with bacon and toast. They made elaborate jokes about the bowls of fresh fruit that appeared at lunch, about the ice cream served on Sundays, about the cookies that accompanied evening coffee. Their mockery grew more elaborate, more theatrical, as if they were performing their disdain for each other as much as for their captors. Matsuda became the ringleader of these displays. He had been a supply officer, had managed logistics for an entire division, and fancied himself an expert on military efficiency. He gave lectures to his fellow prisoners about how the American approach to feeding troops revealed fundamental strategic weaknesses. "Look at the waste," he would say, gesturing at the serving line where mess crew scraped uneaten food into waste barrels. "Look at the complexity of their supply chains, the refrigeration they require, the fuel they burn just to transport and store all this unnecessary variety. A disciplined army needs only rice, fish, and vegetables. Everything else is weakness disguised as strength." The other prisoners nodded along, grateful for any framework that allowed them to maintain pride in defeat. If they had lost because Americans were soft rather than because Americans were superior, the loss became more bearable. If American abundance was actually a liability rather than an advantage, Japanese poverty became a virtue. The mental gymnastics were transparent to Holloway, but he understood the human need behind them. What began to trouble him, though, was the selective blindness these men displayed. They saw American rations but refused to acknowledge American capacity. They mocked the food but ignored what the food represented.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Every meal served to every prisoner required industrial agriculture, transportation networks, refrigeration systems, and supply chains that spanned continents and oceans. The prisoners were eating proof of American industrial might 3 times a day and choosing to see only decadence. Captain Chen noticed the dynamic too. "They're protecting themselves," he explained to Holloway one evening in the camp administration office. "If they admit that American abundance comes from superior organization and industrial capacity, they have to confront how completely Japan was outmatched. It's easier to see it as a moral failing than a material one." The camp's routine settled into predictable patterns as winter deepened. The prisoners worked on maintenance details, shoveling snow, repairing buildings, splitting firewood for the voracious coal furnaces. They were paid nominal wages in camp scrip that could be spent at the canteen for small luxuries like cigarettes, candy, and writing paper. They received mail from Japan, sporadic and heavily censored, bringing news of the devastation their homeland had suffered. They attended mandatory classes in democratic principles and American history, sitting stone-faced through lectures about freedom and individual rights. And they ate. 3 times a day they filed into the mess halls and consumed meals that would have seemed fantastical to them a year earlier. The mockery continued, but Holloway noticed it was becoming more ritualistic, less spontaneous. The prisoners had to maintain their performance of disdain even as their bodies recovered from years of deprivation. Men who had arrived skeletal were gaining weight. Skin that had been gray and papery was regaining color. Energy levels were rising. The evidence of what proper nutrition could accomplish was written on their own bodies. In February, something shifted. A shipment of supplies arrived from the main depot in Chicago, delayed by 2 weeks due to a massive blizzard that had closed railways across the upper Midwest. Among the standard provisions were several crates that had been misrouted, intended for frontline units, but redirected to Camp McCoy due to the administrative chaos of rapid demobilization. Holloway's mess sergeant, a taciturn Pole named Stanislaw Kowalski, opened the crates in the storage warehouse and let out a low whistle. "Sergeant Holloway, you need to see this," Kowalski called out, his voice carrying an unusual note of excitement. Holloway joined him in the warehouse, where Kowalski had pried open one of the wooden crates to reveal rows of olive-drab cans and waxed cardboard boxes, sea rations. Not the basic garrison supplies they had been serving, but the combat rations designed for soldiers in the field, the food that went to men at the sharp end of war. Kowalski held up one of the cans, turning it so Holloway could read the label. "Ham and lima beans, meat and vegetable hash, chicken and vegetables. Jesus, Sarge, there's even cigarettes and candy in here." There were 12 crates in total, enough sea rations to feed the entire prisoner population for a week. Holloway did the mental calculation quickly. The misrouted shipment created an opportunity, but he wasn't sure what kind. The Army's regulations on prisoner feeding were clear: adequate nutrition, basic variety, nothing that could be construed as preferential treatment. Sea rations technically fell within those guidelines, but they represented a significant upgrade from standard mess hall fare. "We serving this to the prisoners?" Kowalski asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. The question carried weight. Kowalski had fought in North Africa and Sicily before a shrapnel wound had relegated him to stateside duty. He had eaten thousands of sea ration meals in foxholes and bombed-out buildings. He knew what they represented. Holloway made his decision. "Yeah, it's Army food. They're Army prisoners. Besides, it'll save us the trouble of cooking for a week. You and the boys can use the time to do that deep cleaning you've been putting off." The first sea ration service happened the following evening. Instead of the usual serving line, Holloway's crew distributed the waxed cardboard cartons directly to prisoners at their tables. Each carton contained a complete meal, main course can, bread or crackers, dessert, candy, cigarettes, matches, and an accessory packet with coffee, sugar, salt, and chewing gum. The prisoners stared at the cartons with suspicion, unsure what they were receiving. Yamamoto opened his carton first, examining each component with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust anything at face value. He held up the main course can, reading the label aloud in heavily accented English, meat and vegetable stew. He showed it to his neighbors, who began opening their own cartons, discovering the variety within. No two cartons were quite the same. Some contained ham, others chicken, others beef. The desserts varied: fruit cocktail, peaches, pound cake. The candy ranged from hard caramels to chocolate bars. The mockery began immediately, following the now familiar pattern. Matsuda stood up, holding his carton like evidence in a trial. "Look at this absurdity," he announced in Japanese, his voice carrying across the mess hall. "Not only do Americans overcomplicate military feeding, they mass-produce individual luxury packages. The waste in packaging alone could feed a Japanese battalion for a week. This is why they needed so many ships, so many trucks, so much fuel. They cannot fight without surrounding themselves with comfort." The other prisoners laughed on cue, but Holloway noticed something different in the sound. It was thinner than before, less certain. Some of the men were examining the sea rations with what looked like genuine curiosity, rather than theatrical disdain. A corporal named Hiroshi Tanaka was reading the instructions printed on his carton with intense focus, his lips moving as he sounded out the English words. What happened next would become the turning point, though nobody recognized it at the time. One of the younger prisoners, a private named Yoshio Nakamura, who couldn't have been more than 18, opened his accessory packet and discovered the instant coffee. He had watched American guards prepare coffee from these packets, had smelled the rich aroma, but had never tasted it. Following the printed instructions, he tore open the coffee packet, dumped it into his canteen cup, added hot water from the urn at the end of the table, and stirred in sugar. The first sip made Nakamura's eyes widen. He took another sip, then a longer drink. He looked at the packet in his hand as if it had performed magic. Then, forgetting himself, forgetting the performance he was supposed to maintain, he turned to the prisoner next to him and said in rapid Japanese, "This is incredible. This is better than anything our officers ever had. How is this just standard issue?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Other prisoners began preparing their own coffee, and Holloway watched the same revelation ripple across faces. These were men who had spent years drinking bitter tea or crude substitutes made from roasted barley. Real coffee, with real sugar, was a luxury that even wealthy Japanese civilians rarely enjoyed. And here it was, packaged in individual portions, distributed as casually as ammunition. Matsuda tried to reclaim the narrative. "It proves my point," he said loudly. "An army that needs coffee to function is an army that lacks spiritual strength." Japanese soldiers fought for years on nothing but rice and determination, but his words rang hollow. The other prisoners were opening cans, heating contents over small camp stoves improvised from empty containers, discovering that the food inside was not just abundant, but genuinely good. Holloway's mess crew had explained to him what combat soldiers knew. Sea rations were not gourmet food, but they were carefully designed to provide maximum nutrition, variety, and morale support in the worst possible conditions. Each component had been tested and refined based on feedback from soldiers in the field. The recipes were optimized for taste under stress. The packaging was engineered to survive being dropped from airplanes, submerged in water, or buried in mud. These rations represented thousands of hours of research, millions of dollars in development, and the full weight of American industrial and scientific capability. The prisoners ate in unusual silence that evening. The mockery had faltered, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like contemplation. Yamamoto finished his meal, carefully read every word printed on his carton, and then sat staring at the empty containers for a long time. Holloway saw him run his finger along the waxed cardboard, examining the waterproof coating, testing the strength of the material. The young lieutenant was beginning to understand something, though he clearly didn't want to. Over the next several days, as the prisoners continued to receive C rations, the atmosphere in the mess halls changed dramatically. The theatrical disdain disappeared. Men began trading components, seeking out preferred combinations, discussing the relative merits of different main courses. They treated the cigarettes and candy with reverence, often saving them rather than consuming them immediately. The coffee became a particular point of fascination, with prisoners experimenting with different sugar ratios, comparing brewing techniques, savoring each cup. Tanaka, who had been a university student before conscription, began asking questions. He approached Captain Chen during an evening roll call and, speaking halting English supplemented with Japanese, asked about the rations. How many different types exist? How are they produced in such quantity? How does the food remain preserved without refrigeration? How can such complexity be maintained across so many thousands of miles? Chen answered patiently, explaining the basics of industrial food production, of canning technology, of the logistical networks that supported American forces worldwide. Tanaka listened with the intensity of a man whose worldview was crumbling and reforming. That night, he translated Chen's explanations for other prisoners, and Holloway watched men who had been combat veterans, hardened soldiers who had seen years of brutal fighting, listening like schoolchildren to descriptions of American canning factories and supply depots. The revelation spread through the prisoner population like a slow-burning fire. These men had spent years hearing propaganda about American weakness and decadence. They had been told that Japanese spiritual strength would overcome American material advantage. They had believed, because they needed to believe, that their poverty was a virtue and American abundance was a vice. The C rations destroyed those comfortable lies not through argument but through undeniable physical evidence. Matsuda, who had been the most vocal critic, went silent. Holloway noticed him during meals, eating mechanically, his face showing internal struggle. One evening, the supply officer approached Holloway directly, speaking through Chen as translator. "I need to understand," Matsuda said, his voice strained. "These rations that you give to prisoners, to defeated enemies, are these the same rations your soldiers eat in combat?" "Yes," Holloway replied simply. "And your soldiers complain about them? I have heard American guards making jokes about the food. They complain constantly. Nobody likes C rations, they get sick of them, they trade for anything different." Matsuda absorbed this information with visible difficulty. "In the Philippines, in the final months before I was captured, our rations were reduced to 1 cup of rice per day, sometimes less. Sometimes we ate grass, bark, anything we could find. Officers received the same portions as enlisted men. We told ourselves this was because we were cut off, because American submarines had destroyed our supply ships. But I managed logistics. I saw the warehouse inventories. Even at the beginning, even when the supply lines were open, we never had anything like this. Not for frontline soldiers, not for officers, not for anyone." He paused, struggling with what he needed to say next. "I have been telling myself that American abundance was weakness. That you won, because you had more supplies, not because you used them better. But these rations, this is not just abundance. This is engineering, this is planning, this is thinking about what soldiers need and providing it, not just food but morale, not just calories but care. We never did this. We never even conceived of doing this. We told our soldiers to endure, to sacrifice, to draw strength from suffering. You told your soldiers, here is good food, here is coffee, here is candy, here is everything we can give you because we value you. And then you gave the same thing to us, your enemies, your prisoners." The words came out like a confession, like something that had been building pressure for months and finally broken through. Other prisoners nearby had stopped eating, were listening to Matsuda's admission. Nobody laughed. Nobody mocked. The truth was too overwhelming. "This is why we lost," Matsuda continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because our soldiers lacked courage. Not because our tactics were wrong. We lost because we built a military system that consumed its own soldiers, that treated men as expendable, that mistook deprivation for discipline. You built a system that sustained soldiers, that supported them, that treated them as valuable assets worth preserving. Your sea rations are not proof of weakness, they are proof of wisdom. The silence in the mess hall was profound. Holloway felt the weight of the moment, understanding that he was witnessing something significant, though he couldn't quite articulate what. These men had not just lost a war. They were losing the framework they had used to understand themselves, their society, their entire lives. Captain Chen spoke into the silence, his voice gentle. Your courage was never in question. Japanese soldiers fought with incredible bravery. But bravery alone cannot overcome industrial capacity combined with respect for human needs. America did not win because Americans were braver or more disciplined. America won because American industry could produce unlimited sea rations while Japanese industry could not produce enough rice. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. The prisoners began asking questions about everything, not just about food, but about American society, industry, education, government. Men who had been trained to see democracy as weakness wanted to understand how a system based on individual freedom could generate such collective power. Veterans who had absorbed years of propaganda about American racial inferiority wanted to reconcile those lies with the evidence of their own eyes. Yamamoto became particularly obsessed with understanding American logistics. He pestered Chen with questions about supply chains, about how many tons of supplies landed on Pacific beaches each day, about the Liberty ships that had been mass-produced to transport those supplies, about the truck factories and aircraft plants and all the invisible infrastructure that had supported American forces. Chen, recognizing genuine intellectual hunger, obtained maps and charts, walking Yamamoto through the staggering scale of American industrial mobilization. Your forces in the Pacific were at the end of a supply line that stretched 7,000 miles from American factories, Chen explained, spreading maps across a table in the camp library. Every bullet, every ration, every gallon of fuel had to cross an ocean, and yet you never lacked supplies. You never ran out. Your rations never diminished. The same food soldiers ate in California, they ate in Okinawa. How is that possible? Yamamoto stared at the maps, doing calculations in his head, confronting the mathematical reality of what had defeated him. We told ourselves you were overextended, he said slowly. We believed distance would be your weakness. We thought the farther you came the weaker you would become, but you just built longer supply lines. You made distance irrelevant. You turned the Pacific Ocean into a highway. Exactly, Chen confirmed. And that's what the sea rations represent. They're not luxury. They're logistics perfected. They're industrial capacity made visible. Every can you open, every packet of coffee you drink, that's American engineering solving the problem of how to feed millions of men thousands of miles from home. That's what you were really fighting. The conversation spread beyond the camp library. In work details, during evening hours, men who had spent years as enemies began actually talking to their American guards, asking questions, seeking understanding. Holloway found himself in long discussions with prisoners about farming, about how Nebraska's mechanized agriculture compared to Japanese rice cultivation, about tractors and combines and the infrastructure that supported industrial farming. The prisoners were shocked to learn that individual American farmers owned machines that could do the work of hundreds of laborers, that agricultural productivity in the United States was orders of magnitude higher than in Japan. One evening in March, as winter began loosening its grip and the first hints of spring appeared in longer days and slightly warmer temperatures, Holloway was approached by a group of prisoners led by Nakamura, the young private who had first discovered the coffee. They had a request, delivered through Chen's translation. We would like to understand what American soldiers actually eat, Nakamura explained, his face earnest. Not C rations but normal food. When soldiers are not in combat, when they are at bases, what do they eat? We realize we do not understand this. We have been eating better as prisoners than we ever ate as soldiers, and you say this is normal. We need to see what normal means. Holloway considered the request. It was unusual, but not unreasonable. He consulted with the camp commander, who authorized a tour of the main mess facility and food storage warehouses. The following Saturday, Holloway led a group of 20 prisoners through areas of the camp they had never seen, showing them the industrial-scale kitchens, the massive refrigeration units, the warehouses stocked with provisions. The prisoners walked through the storage facility in stunned silence. Holloway watched their faces as they absorbed the scale pallets of canned goods stacked 20 feet high, entire rooms devoted to frozen meat, bins of fresh vegetables that arrived weekly by truck, bakery supplies measured in tons rather than pounds. This was just the supply for one medium-sized camp, feeding perhaps 3,000 people. The mathematical implications were staggering. Matsuda stopped in front of a pallet of canned fruit, reading the labels carefully. "This single pallet," he said quietly, "contains more canned fruit than I saw in a year managing supplies for an entire division. This is storage for what, 2 weeks?" About that, Holloway confirmed. Maybe 3 weeks, depending on consumption rates. And there are how many camps like this in America? Dozens. Plus the supply depots for overseas forces are larger, much larger. This is actually a relatively small operation. Matsuda closed his eyes, and Holloway saw the man's hands trembling slightly. When the supply officer spoke again, his voice carried an edge of anguish. "We never had a chance, did we? This entire time, from the very beginning, we were fighting an enemy that could afford to feed its prisoners better than we could feed our frontline troops. We were fighting an industrial base that could produce more in its excess capacity than we could produce in total mobilization, and we thought we would win through fighting spirit." The tour ended in the main mess facility, where Holloway's crew was preparing lunch for the American Guard contingent. The prisoners watched as industrial mixers prepared dough for fresh bread, as massive ovens baked dozens of loaves simultaneously, as pressure cookers handled vegetables at scale. One of the mess crew, sensing the educational moment, explained the equipment, showed how it worked, discussed the efficiency and output. Tanaka translated the information for his fellow prisoners, but Holloway noticed the young student's voice was shaking. The cumulative weight of these revelations was clearly overwhelming. These men had believed in Japanese superiority, had staked their identities on it, had fought and killed and watched friends die for it. And now they were confronting evidence that every assumption had been wrong, that the war had been unwinnable from the start, that their sacrifices had been rendered futile by industrial mathematics. That night, there was no evening roll call ceremony in the usual sense. Instead, a large group of prisoners gathered in the recreation barracks and requested a meeting with Captain Chen. Holloway was invited to attend. What followed was a remarkable 4-hour conversation in which the prisoners, speaking through Chen's translation, tried to reconcile their experiences with their beliefs. "We were told Americans were weak," one former sergeant said. "We saw movies showing Americans as soft, as cowardly, as lacking Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit. How do we understand this now? You feed prisoners better than we fed our soldiers, and yet you won the war. Where is weakness in this?" Chen considered his response carefully. "Your government confused comfort with weakness and suffering with strength. But there is no virtue in unnecessary suffering. A soldier who is well-fed fights better than a starving soldier. A soldier who is valued by his society fights harder than a soldier who is treated as expendable. Americans did not win because we were soft. We won because we understood that taking care of soldiers' practical needs made them more effective, not less." The conversation continued late into the night, touching on topics that went far beyond food. The prisoners wanted to understand democracy, wanted to know how a society that emphasized individual freedom could generate collective action. They wanted to understand American education, wondering how a nation could mass-produce engineers and scientists while Japan had concentrated advanced education in tiny elite populations. They wanted to understand American industrial culture, trying to comprehend how workers who owned their own homes and cars could be more productive than workers organized under rigid hierarchical control. Holloway listened more than he spoke, but when he did contribute, he tried to be honest about American flaws and limitations. "We're not perfect," he said at one point. "Our society has serious problems, contradictions, injustices, but one thing we got right was understanding that prosperity makes nations stronger, not weaker. When ordinary people live well, when they have enough to eat, and opportunities for education, and hope for better futures, they build powerful societies." Japan organized itself around sacrifice and hierarchy, and telling people that suffering was noble. That might create brave soldiers, but it doesn't create the kind of industrial base that can produce unlimited sea rations. In April, as camp regulations relaxed slightly, with the confirmed end of hostilities and the beginning of repatriation planning, the prisoners were allowed to work in the camp gardens preparing the soil for spring planting. Holloway supervised these details, watching men who had been Imperial Japanese Army soldiers carefully tending rows of vegetables under the instruction of American agriculture specialists. Yamamoto approached him one afternoon, his hands dirty from working soil, his face thoughtful. "Sergeant Holloway, may I ask you a personal question?" "Sure, Lieutenant. What did you do before the war, before you became a soldier?" "I was a farmer. My family had land in Nebraska. I grew up working crops, raising animals, doing everything that needs doing on a farm." Yamamoto nodded slowly. "And you will return to farming after you leave the army?" "That's the plan. My brother kept the farm running while I was away. There'll be work waiting when I get home." In Japan, a farmer's son who became an officer would never return to farming, Yamamoto said quietly. "It would be considered degrading, a loss of status. Officers are samurai class, farmers are peasant class, the distinctions are absolute. But here, you speak of farming as honorable work. You see no contradiction between being a soldier and being a farmer. No contradiction at all. Most of the guys I served with came from farms or factories or stores. We were civilians who became soldiers for the duration. War's over, we go back to being civilians. That's how it works in America." "That is why you won," Yamamoto said, with the air of a man articulating a conclusion reached after long thought. "You created a military from your whole society, not from a separate warrior class. You armed farmers and factory workers and shopkeepers with the products of your farms and factories and shops. You brought your entire civilization to war, while we brought only our warrior tradition. We thought that tradition would be enough. We were wrong." The repatriations began in May. Groups of prisoners were processed for return to Japan, given documentation, provided with basic supplies, and transported to West Coast ports for shipment home. The men leaving were not the same men who had arrived. They had been defeated in battle, but they had been educated in defeat, had learned lessons that most of them would carry for the rest of their lives. On the morning of his departure, Matsuda sought out Holloway for a final conversation. The former supply officer had been transformed by his months at Camp McCoy. He had gained 30 pounds, his health restored by adequate nutrition. More significantly, his worldview had been reconstructed from its foundations. He spoke to Holloway through Chen's translation with an intensity that suggested he needed to articulate something important before leaving. "I spent 4 years of war managing logistics," Matsuda began. "I was good at my job. I worked miracles with inadequate supplies. I kept units functioning when any reasonable assessment would have said it was impossible. I took pride in this, in making something from nothing, in the efficiency forced on us by scarcity. But I understand now that this was the wrong kind of pride. I should have been ashamed. Not of my efforts, but of a system that required such miracles, that treated adequate supplies as luxuries, that confused poverty with virtue." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I return to Japan, I will tell people what I learned here." Some will not want to hear it. They will say I was corrupted by the enemy, that I have forgotten our Japanese spirit. But I will tell them anyway, because it is true. I will tell them that we lost the war not on battlefields, but in factories, not through lack of courage, but through lack of industrial capacity, not because our soldiers were inferior, but because our system was inferior. I will tell them that the Americans fed their prisoners better than we fed our troops, and that this difference explains everything. Holloway shook Matsuda's hand, feeling the firmness of the grip, the sincerity of the gesture. I hope Japan rebuilds well, he said. I hope you get to use what you learned here. I will try, Matsuda replied. Japan must change completely. We must stop worshipping suffering and start pursuing prosperity. We must stop organizing society around hierarchy and start organizing it around productivity. We must become more like America, though it shames me to admit this. The sea rations taught me this lesson. Food taught me what battlefields could not. The last group of prisoners left Camp McCoy in late June 1946. By then, the camp was already being repurposed, preparing to receive the next wave of displaced persons, the next group of people whose lives had been disrupted by the war. Holloway stayed on for another month, helping with the transition before finally receiving his discharge papers and the train ticket that would take him back to Nebraska. On his last evening at the camp, he walked through the empty mess hall where so many revelations had occurred. He thought about the laughter that first night, about the mockery that had seemed so cruel and defensive. He thought about the silence that had replaced it, about men confronting uncomfortable truths, about the strange intimacy of teaching former enemies to see themselves and their society more clearly. Captain Chen found him there, also preparing to leave, heading back to California and civilian life. Remarkable experience, Chen said, standing next to Holloway in the empty hall. I've processed thousands of prisoners during this war, but I've never seen anything quite like what happened here. Food became a teaching tool. Meals became education. We broke through propaganda, not with counter-propaganda, but with evidence they couldn't deny. Do you think it'll matter? Holloway asked. Do you think what these guys learned here will change anything in Japan? Chen considered carefully. Some of them will forget. Some will decide it was all a trick, will retreat back into comfortable narratives about Japanese superiority. But some, like Matsuda and Yamamoto and Tanaka, some of them will remember. They will carry these lessons home. They will rebuild Japan with different assumptions. That matters. The transformation that began at Camp McCoy with sea rations and mockery rippled outward in ways nobody could have predicted. Years later, Holloway would read about Japan's post-war economic miracle, about how defeated enemies became prosperous allies, about how a militaristic empire transformed into an industrial democracy. He would wonder how many of those changes were influenced by men who had learned uncomfortable truths in American prison camps, who had discovered that abundance came from systems rather than spirits, that prosperity mattered more than propaganda. The revelation extended beyond individual prisoners to shape how both nations understood themselves. American military planners studied the camp experiences, analyzing why adequate nutrition and humane treatment had proven more effective at changing minds than any propaganda campaign. The lessons influenced post-war occupation policies in both Japan and Germany, contributing to Reconstruction strategies that emphasized rebuilding prosperity rather than imposing punishment. Japanese society underwent profound transformation in the decades following surrender. The men who returned from American camps brought home radical ideas about democracy, industrial organization, and social structure. They had seen proof that individual freedom could coexist with collective strength, that worker welfare enhanced rather than diminished productivity, that investing in human capital generated returns that authoritarian systems could never match. These insights, learned over meals that had seemed absurdly generous, helped reshape an entire civilization. The strategic implications echoed through the Cold War and beyond. American policymakers understood that defeating enemies on battlefields mattered less than winning them over afterward. The same nation that had dropped atomic bombs on Japanese cities also fed Japanese prisoners with unprecedented care, demonstrating a capacity for both overwhelming force and deliberate compassion. That combination proved more powerful than either quality alone could have been. The industrial lessons proved equally significant. The C rations that had seemed like simple field rations actually represented sophisticated integration of agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, and human psychology. They embodied American strength, not through any single innovation but through systematic excellence across multiple domains. Nations that wanted to compete with America had to master not just military technology but entire economic ecosystems. The psychological dimension remained most profound. The prisoners who had mocked American food discovered that their mockery revealed more about themselves than about their captors. They had confused simplicity with strength, had mistaken deprivation for discipline, had believed that suffering built character rather than simply causing harm. The abundance they encountered forced them to question every assumption they had held about power, purpose, and what made nations strong. By the time Holloway returned to Nebraska and resumed farming, the world had already begun changing in ways the C rations had helped catalyze. Japan was embracing democracy and industrial development with the fervor of converts. American military doctrine was incorporating lessons about the strategic value of treating both soldiers and prisoners well. The global order was being rebuilt on assumptions that abundance strengthened rather than weakened, that prosperity generated power, that taking care of practical human needs produced better outcomes than glorifying sacrifice. The mess hall at Camp McCoy was eventually demolished, replaced by other structures serving other purposes, but the conversations that had occurred there, the revelations that had transformed men who thought they understood war and discovered they understood nothing, those echoes persisted. Food had become education, meals had become diplomacy. Simple military rations had exposed fundamental truths about civilization, power, and what actually matters when nations compete. Decades later, historians would debate what factors most contributed to post-war reconciliation between America and Japan. They would analyze treaties, economic policies, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic initiatives. Most would overlook the thousands of small moments in prison camps across America, where defeated soldiers confronted evidence that shattered their worldview and forced them to rebuild understanding from scratch. They would miss how something as mundane as C rations had carried lessons more powerful than any formal peace agreement. The story that began with mockery on a frozen December evening ended with transformation that spanned generations. Japanese prisoners who had laughed at American abundance returned home carrying seeds of change. American guards who had watched those transformations understood that winning wars required more than battlefield victories. Both groups carried forward insights about what actually made nations strong, what actually generated power, what actually mattered when the shooting stopped and the real work of building peace began. Holloway kept one C ration can on his farm for the rest of his life, a battered olive-drab cylinder that sat on a shelf in his office. Visitors who asked about it received varying explanations depending on his mood and their capacity for longer stories. Sometimes he would simply say it was a souvenir from the war. Other times he would talk about what it had taught him, about how simple things could carry profound meanings, about how the difference between victory and defeat often came down to whether nations took care of practical needs or pursued abstract ideals. The final lesson took decades to fully emerge. The prisoners who had mocked American food because it seemed to prove American weakness had unknowingly identified American strength. A nation that could afford to feed prisoners generously, that built systems to support individual soldiers, that valued human welfare enough to engineer solutions to practical problems. That nation possessed power deeper and more sustainable than any warrior tradition could generate. The abundance was not despite American strength, but because of it. When Matsuda wrote his memoirs decades later, he devoted an entire chapter to the evening he had opened his first C ration carton at Camp McCoy. He described the moment with the precision of someone recalling a religious conversion, because in many ways that was what it had been. Everything he believed about strength, discipline, and national power had inverted in that instant. The life he lived afterward, the Japan he helped rebuild, the prosperity he witnessed and contributed to, all of it flowed from lessons contained in waxed cardboard and olive drab cans. The transformation from terror to understanding, from mockery to respect, from assumption to knowledge, took less than 6 months in most cases. The prisoners who arrived believing American abundance, proved American weakness, departed knowing that abundance was the foundation of American power. The guards who expected to maintain control through force, discovered that generosity accomplished more than coercion ever could. Both groups left changed by encounters that reduced war to its most basic element, whether nations cared for their people or consumed them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.